When Lindsay Hawker graduated from college, she was excited to see the world. Her journey started in Tokyo, but nobody could have guessed Tokyo would also be where it ended, with her brutalized body discovered buried in a bathtub full of sand on an apartment balcony. Bea, who ran a driving school, and Julia, who worked as a policy advisor for Transport for London, were proud parents of 3 daughters. Lindsay was the middle child, with an older sister named Lisa and a younger sister named Louise. They were a tight, hard-working family. Lindsay had just gotten her biology degree from Leeds University, and she was ready to spread her wings and travel. After doing a lot of research, she had become fascinated with the idea of teaching English in Japan. Bill and Julia were nervous about her going. Maybe their gut feelings were hinting at the terrible things to come. Still, they let 21-year-old Lindsay start her adventure, even though they had doubts. Right before Lindsay was supposed to leave for Japan, her older sister Lisa told her to be careful. "Remember what happened to Lucy Blackman," Lisa said. It was a chilling thought because Lucy's story was awful. She was also a young British woman eager for adventure, who worked as a hostess with a friend at a high-end Tokyo nightclub catering to rich businessmen. One of those men took 21-year-old Lucy out on a private date. Sadly, that was the last time anyone ever saw her. Even worse than her disappearance, her remains were found 7 months later. Her body had been cut apart and buried in a shallow cave. With this warning in mind, Lindsay traveled to Tokyo a few months later in October 2006 and started her job at the Nova Intercultural Institute, a well-known English language school. Lindsay settled in quickly with her 2 roommates, who also taught at the school. She got really into her work and grew to love Japan. In fact, she felt safer there than she did back in Britain. In December 2006, a couple of months into Lindsay's time in Tokyo, her parents and younger sister Louise visited to celebrate her birthday. They checked out her favorite spots and had a special birthday dinner at a fancy world-famous bar. And while they knew it was a really unique experience, only later would they realize how much they would forever treasure the memory of that night, which turned out to be Lindsay's last birthday. As they kept noticing how friendly Lindsay was with people she didn't know, her father felt a bit worried. He mentioned his concern to Lindsay, but she didn't think much of it. She was the English teacher after all, and she wanted to fit in. Could Lindsay's natural trust in strangers have somehow led to disaster? Lindsay loved her new job so much that she and her boyfriend of 4 years, Ryan Garside, made plans to spend the coming summer together. They would save up for their big plans to travel the globe. They actually planned a whole year of traveling before returning to Britain, where Lindsay would go back to school to become a doctor. Sadly, those plans would never happen. Everything went terribly wrong on the night of March 25, 2007, when Lindsay's roommates realized she hadn't come home since leaving that morning. It wasn't like Lindsay to disappear for any length of time, much less stay out all night. The next day, staff at the school called Lindsay's father and told him Lindsay had missed 2 days of teaching without contacting the school. Something was clearly very wrong. Just 5 days before she was last seen alive, Lindsay was hanging out with friends at a local bar she liked to go to. According to the owner, also a British guy, Lindsay wasn't a big drinker at all. She always headed home early. The bar was just a place to watch soccer with friends. Like on any other night, Lindsay got on her bike and went home. However, it would soon come out that someone had been watching Lindsay. Back at her apartment, with a roommate there, Lindsay heard a knock at the door. She answered and found a young Japanese man who wanted to take private English lessons from her. And when he asked, Lindsay let the man into the apartment. During a kind of weird interaction, the man drew a picture of Lindsay. And on the paper, he put his phone number and his address on the back. At that moment, nobody could have known how important that piece of paper with the strange drawing would soon become. Lindsay had agreed to give the English lessons. Still, the man made her feel uneasy, but she couldn't pass up the chance to make some extra money for her travel plans. But Lindsay was smart. She would only teach him in a public place for safety. On the morning of Sunday, March 25th, Lindsay left her apartment and went to a coffee shop near the man's place in the town of Yotoku. Surveillance footage shows Lindsay entering the shop behind a man. Lindsay looks pretty uncomfortable, constantly fixing her hair. Lindsay frequently touching her hair and face could be a way to calm herself because she might have felt anxious or nervous. She left the shop before him and got into a taxi with him. They headed back to his apartment so the man could get money to pay Lindsay for the lesson. When they got to his apartment, Lindsay asked the taxi driver to wait since she'd be right back. Tragically, it seems it was all a planned trap, and she would never leave that apartment alive. The taxi driver waited a few minutes, then drove off. The next day, Lindsay was reported missing. That is when the police used the crucial information from the odd drawing found at Lindsay's place. Several officers went to the address, which belonged to a man named Tatsuya Ichihashi. He politely answered the apartment door, but then immediately ran. And then they found her out on the balcony. It was unbelievably horrible. Lindsay had been buried in a bathtub, with one hand partly sticking out of the mix of sand and dirt. She was barely recognizable. Her long hair had been cut off, her body was tied up and badly beaten, and her neck was broken. What kind of monster could have done this to Lindsay? The details that came out were hard to grasp. Tatsuya was the main and only suspect, yet the case seemed confusing on the surface. The 28-year-old was unemployed, the child of wealthy, successful parents who gave him a generous monthly allowance. His father was a brain surgeon and his mother was a dentist. He didn't seem like the type of person to do something like this, or did he? A parasitic lifestyle is a trait of a psychopath, along with having no realistic long-term goals. Psychopaths also get bored easily, which might lead them to commit crimes for the thrill. There had been a sign something was wrong when Tatsuya was 13. In school, he was assigned to write about his dreams for the future. According to a friend, he wrote in great detail about his fantasies of spying on girls while they got dressed. A week after Lindsay was last seen alive, her father made a public appeal to people in Japan to try to get information. He said the murder was a source of shame for the nation. And it seems his appeal worked a little. Shortly after, the police released the video footage of Lindsay's last movements to TV stations. About 2 weeks after Lindsay's murder, it's believed Tatsuya called his parents, only to let the line go dead when his father answered. But the message was clear that he was still alive, despite media rumors that he had killed himself. There were tons of other theories. Some wondered if maybe he was involved with the Japanese mafia, known as the Yakuza. It was thought that he idolized the violent gangs, but crime experts didn't think that was likely. What happened to Lindsay wouldn't have been worth the consequences for the Yakuza. Others thought he was able to avoid capture because he was living in Tokyo's red light district dressed as a woman. In late October of the next year, Lindsay's family got devastating news. Tokyo police planned to cut down their team of 140 officers assigned to Lindsay's case. Given Japan's geography, with its mountains and remote wilderness, they assumed Tatsuya would never be found. But after that setback came a big break. On November 10, 2009, police were contacted by a ticket agent at Osaka Ferryport who said someone looking like Tatsuya had bought a ticket to Okinawa. Police quickly approached and questioned the man. He finally gave in with 3 words. The search was finally over. "I am Ichihashi," he said. Bill's instincts had been right. Tatsuya had been hiding in plain sight the whole time. Apparently, he'd been working in construction during his months on the run. As a loner, he seemed to have gotten good at blending in. But how had he avoided capture for so long? As the story came out, the strangest twist of all would soon be revealed. Tatsuya had done plastic surgery on himself. He'd cut off part of his lower lip using scissors, removed molds from a cheek with a box cutter, and even did a nose job on himself with a needle and thread. Besides his DIY plastic surgery, he'd saved money from his jobs, and had 2 professional procedures that included nose jobs, changed eyelids, cheek implants, and lip thinning treatments. Changing his appearance was the ultimate trick, which fits with deception and conning, 2 traits of psychopathy. Ironically, the very procedures meant to hide his identity would lead to his capture. It was a plastic surgeon, the second one, who got things moving. The surgeon got suspicious of the man who wanted to completely change how he looked. Police were alerted, and a photo of his changed face was released. Within a few days, he was caught at the ferry terminal in Osaka. Lindsay's family and friends were relieved the suspect was finally arrested. But it wouldn't be until early July of 2011, almost 2 years after his capture, that he would stand trial. At the trial, Lindsay's parents and sisters listened as Tatsuya described the horrors Lindsay went through in her last hours in that apartment. She followed him from the taxi to his front door and waited while he went inside to get her payment for the English lesson. But then he told how he punched her and dragged her into his apartment. He admitted to assaulting Lindsay. However, he didn't admit to intentionally killing her. He claimed it was an accident. He panicked and accidentally suffocated her when she screamed for help because he was afraid someone might hear her. It seems unlikely Tatsuya would have let Lindsay leave after assaulting her, since she could easily identify him and even give his address to the police. He might have been downplaying her murder to try to get a lighter sentence. Lindsay's family asked for the convicted murderer to get the maximum penalty under Japanese law. Japan does have the death penalty, which is execution by hanging. It's usually saved for only the worst criminals. And unlike in the US, it's extremely rare in Japan to get the death penalty for killing just one person. The sentence came just days after the verdict was reached. Almost 4.5 years after Lindsay's murder, Tatsuya was sentenced to life in prison. Some red flags to watch out for. The first warning sign was that Tatsuya showed up uninvited at Lindsay's door, which suggests he might have followed her home. The drawing Tatsuya did of Lindsay could be seen as flattering or charming, but it seems like a weird thing to do the first time they met. But since there isn't anything obviously sinister about a drawing, Lindsay might have brushed off this odd event. Lindsay supposedly felt a bit apprehensive about giving lessons to Tatsuya. However, she decided to meet with him anyway, as she might have felt there was no logical reason to say no. She took precautions like meeting him in a public place, but he then convinced her to go to his apartment. Although she may not have felt completely comfortable with this, it's possible she told herself she could still take safety measures like using public transportation and just waiting in his doorway for him to get the money, how to avoid similar situations. If someone is pressuring you to meet at their home or another private place when you dawn, feel comfortable, don't give in to what they want. Tatsuya manipulated Lindsay into going with him to get money he owed her. If you're in a similar spot, remember that no amount of money is worth putting yourself in a potentially dangerous situation. It can be hard to justify making a decision based on something as small as having a bad feeling about someone. However, it's important to always trust your gut. Ashley Freeman was celebrating her 16th birthday with her best friend Loria Bible. Though the night started with pizza and a sleepover at Ashley's family farm, it ended in tragedy with a fire that destroyed the Freeman home. When the flames were finally put out, there was no sign of either girl. Ashley and Loria had a fun start to their evening on December 29, 1999. After going out for dinner, they kept the celebration going at the Freeman farm along with Ashley's parents, Kathy and Danny. In the very early morning hours of the next day, a call came into the Welch, Oklahoma Fire Department. Firefighters got there around 5:30 a.m., soon after the call came in, to find the Freeman mobile home completely engulfed in flames. Inside, they found Kathy's remains. But where was Danny, and where were the girls? The next day, one of those questions would be answered in the most horrible way. Danny's burned body was discovered in the wreckage. Sadly, it was Loria's parents, Jay and Lorraine, who found the charred remains that police hadn't been able to find the day before, but the girls were still missing. Loria's car was parked out front, keys in the ignition, but how had they vanished without a trace? A search party gathered and went through the property over the next 2 days. Among the things found was an insurance card, but the name on the card wasn't familiar. Loria's purse was also found in the ash and debris that was once a home. Autopsies of Danny and Kathy were done by the Oklahoma Medical Examiner's Office. The findings were disturbing. Each had suffered an execution-style gunshot wound to the head. The state fire marshal later checked the site and concluded the fire had been set on purpose, which was no surprise. Authorities soon thought the killings were drug-related, according to several accounts. Danny was connected to the drug scene. Over the next few years, police kept looking into leads, but each one turned out to be a dead end. Then in 2005, there was a major development in the case. Authorities had focused on a man named Jeremy Jones. The 41-year-old was a convicted killer on death row in Alabama. Coincidentally, records showed Jones was arrested in the early morning hours of December 30, 1999, the day of the fire. The charges included public drunkenness and having drug paraphernalia. The arrest happened just 18 miles from the Freeman home. Were authorities close to solving the case? Then it happened. Jones confessed to killing Kathy and Danny Freeman and setting their home on fire. The deadly fight had been because he was trying to collect a drug debt. He said he hadn't expected to find anyone else at the home, and the girls had surprised him. He then took the girls to Galena, Kansas, shot them, and threw their bodies into an abandoned mine shaft. Finally, this case was on its way to being solved. But there was one thing missing: the girls' bodies. Soon after the confession, authorities organized a search of the mine shaft. Unfortunately, the search didn't find anything. There was still no trace of the missing girls. Then, Jones took back his confession, and authorities were once again back at square one. It might seem surprising that someone would confess to a crime they didn't commit, but it's possible Jeremy made up the story so he could be in the spotlight. He was already on death row, so he might have felt he could get some attention while having nothing to lose. Then he might have enjoyed pulling the rug out from under the police by recanting. When 2009 came around, 10 years had passed, and the case was still unsolved. Hoping to encourage anyone with information to come forward, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation offered up to $10,000 as a reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction in the killings of Danny and Kathy Freeman. Still no luck, and the case stayed cold. Then, very unexpectedly, an interesting development happened at the start of 2017. There was a new sheriff in town, and he had found a box with important information. Authorities kept the items confidential, but someone from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation said the findings were very valuable and gave a clear direction that could potentially solve the case. Everything was about to come out, and the details of the night of the trailer fire and the days that followed were sure to upset even the most experienced detectives. Possible witnesses that had been found were tracked down and interviewed, and a tangled story of evil began to unravel. Remember the insurance ID card found at the scene of the Freeman's burned trailer? Well, the owner was located, and she gave valuable information that got the case moving again. At the time of the Freeman murders and the girls' disappearances, she had been the girlfriend of a man named Phil Welch. Phil happened to live less than a mile from the Freemans at the time of the murders. A few months later, she said he'd been abusive toward her. She'd left her old sedan behind and ended the relationship. Right after the first woman left Phil, another took her place. This woman would provide groundbreaking information, and others would soon tell stories that matched what she said. During her interview, she talked about a conversation she'd overheard between Phil and two other men. She identified the others as David Pennington and Ronnie Dean Bissick. She said they talked about the people killed in Welch, Oklahoma, over a drug debt. She'd heard the girls had been taken and eventually killed, and that Pennington and Bissick had set the Freeman trailer on fire. What she said next was shockingly evil. Phil had nailed a poster to his wall that had a $50,000 reward for information on the disappearances of Ashley and Loria. The poster was a souvenir or reminder of what he'd done, and he was proud of it. But the poster wasn't the worst part. She said Phil had Polaroid photos kept in a leather briefcase, and the images were horrifying. No question about it, the woman stated the girls in the photos matched the images on the poster. In the pictures, their hands were tied and their mouths were gagged. Leads that came in around that time tied another woman to the case. She had lived with David, and she had also overheard disturbing conversations. In fact, she said she heard him talking about the girls all the time. David told her the girls were at the bottom of a pit, and he threatened to throw her in too if she told anyone what she'd heard. And the little car Phil's first girlfriend had left behind when she moved out of his place, she claimed Phil had been using the car at the time of the killings. And that could explain why the first girlfriend's insurance card was found nearby. And then there was the third man, Ronnie. He'd been heard talking about the Freeman murders and the missing girls. Ronnie told an acquaintance about how the girls had been assaulted and tortured in a trailer and picture, and kept alive for several days. Ronnie named Phil as the shooter and said that he and David set the trailer on fire after Phil left with the girls in the little old car. It might seem unbelievable that the two women connected to Phil and David had all this information for years but never reported it. However, they might have been afraid for their own lives, since they knew what the men were capable of. It's also possible the women thought they would get in trouble for not coming forward sooner. With this information, investigators believed it was time to go directly to the men at the center of the rumors: Phil, David, and Ronnie. However, there was a big problem, two big problems to be exact. Phil had died in 2007, and David had died in 2015. That left just one. Things were about to get really bad for old Ronnie. In late April of 2018, Ronnie was arrested on 4 counts of murder, kidnapping, and arson. He was seen more as an accessory than the mastermind, and he pleaded guilty to being an accessory to first-degree murder in mid-July of 2020. Ronnie had an option to get his proposed sentence reduced if he would lead authorities to the remains of Ashley and Loria. The deal was that his 15-year sentence, 10 years in prison, and the remaining 5 suspended, would be cut down to 5 years behind bars if the remains of Ashley and Loria were successfully found. But there would be no such luck for Ronnie or the girls' families, as Ronnie was unable or unwilling to give the location. On August 31st, Ronnie got the 15-year sentence. Loria's mother, Lorene, said she would not stop searching until the girls were brought home. And there's still a shred of hope that the girls' remains will be found. 911. What is the location of your emergency? Russell panting. Okay. Hello? Russell. Hello? Operator 1. Yes. I need you to take a couple deep breaths so I can see what's going on. Russell, my name is Russell Faria. Operator 1. Russell, what's going on there? Russell, I just got home from a friend's house and my wife killed herself. She's on the floor. Operator 1. Okay, Russell, I need you to calm down, honey. Okay? We're gonna get somebody on the way there, okay? Russell crying. Narrator. The frantic 911 call you just heard was made by Russell Faria, just moments after he returned home to find his wife Betsy's body. Betsy had been given months to live when her breast cancer spread to her liver, but it wasn't the cancer that killed her. Betsy and her husband Russell were married on January 21, 2000. They lived in Troy, Missouri. Her sister described her as positive and upbeat, a shining light. And as a couple, Betsy and Russ seemed to be doing okay considering her illness. A friend of Betsy's even described Russ as a loving and doting husband. But all of that would be thrown into question soon. At first, Betsy's cancer had gone into remission, and the couple planned a cruise for their family and friends as a celebration of life in November 2011. Unfortunately, just 1 month before they were supposed to leave, they got the worst news possible. Betsy's cancer had spread to her liver, and even worse, she only had a few more months to live. Still, they went ahead with the cruise and cherished their time together. But things were about to take a drastic turn for the worse, and nobody could have predicted how twisted things would get. It was a typical day on December 27, 2011. Betsy went to morning chemotherapy with an old family friend, Bobby Juan, and Russ was going to pick her up later that night at her mom's after his weekly game night with friends. To Betsy's surprise, her close friend Pam Hupp showed up at treatment and offered to take Betsy home, even though the round trip for Pam would take a full hour. The ladies had met 10 years earlier through their work in insurance sales. Betsy accepted the generous offer. Little did she know this would be her last trip home. Pam dropped Betsy off at home around 7 p.m. Pam called her husband Mark Hupp a few minutes later to let him know she was about to leave Betsy's house and would be home soon. He didn't answer, so Pam left a short message. Betsy chimed in with a quick Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. The call ended, and Pam left Betsy's house, headed for her own. Meanwhile, Russ's evening had been uneventful. His 5 friends had called it a night around 9, and Russ left and stopped at an Arby's for a couple sandwiches. But Russ's life was about to change forever. He got home expecting to find Betsy asleep on the couch, but instead he found her lying on the living room floor near their couch, covered in blood. Russ frantically made his 911 call at 9:40. Russell cries, "Operator 1, what did she do? Do you know?" Russell, "She has a knife in her neck and she stabbed her arms." Russell crying, "Operator 1, okay, calm down, honey." "Is she breathing at all?" "No, she is not breathing." Russell, "No, indistinct." Russell crying, "No, help. A narrator." The terror and raw emotion in Russ's voice are gut-wrenching as he tells the operator that his wife appeared to have taken her own life. His mind might have jumped to the conclusion that Betsy killed herself because of her cancer prognosis. It is not uncommon for people diagnosed with a terminal illness to think about taking their own lives. But when the sheriff's deputy arrived at the scene less than 10 minutes later, it was obvious something far more sinister had happened. She had been stabbed over and over, her arms nearly cut off, wrists slashed to the bone, the knife still sticking out of her neck. Russ was taken outside. An autopsy would show that 55 stab wounds covered her body. This is clear evidence of overkill and is a sign that the victim most likely knew the attacker. Around 11 p.m., a little over an hour after the sheriff's deputy got to the scene, he drove Russ to the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office for questioning. It was a routine procedure. Russ was the spouse of the dead woman, after all. But soon the tone changed, and the questioning turned into an interrogation that would last almost 11 hours. A search of the Faria house found blood on the couple's bedroom light switch plate and on a pair of Russ's slippers in the closet. Russ's game night friends were interviewed while he was being interrogated, and they agreed with the timeline of events Russ had given, but investigators weren't sure if they agreed on the night's events because they made up a story together or if it was just an accurate timeline. At about 6:40 the next morning, 2 detectives arrived to interview Betsy's friend, Pam. She proved to be very helpful to the investigation. 4 days before Betsy was stabbed, Betsy had changed the beneficiary on a $150,000 life insurance policy from Russ to Pam. According to Pam, Russ and Betsy's daughters couldn't be trusted to handle the money, so Pam agreed to manage funds for Betsy's daughters. Pam also claimed Betsy had told her that Russ was physically abusive. The doting husband was starting to sound more like a heartless bully. Russ was released after being in police custody for almost 24 hours, but his freedom was only temporary. He was arrested on January 4, 2012, the day after Betsy's funeral, on charges of first-degree murder and armed criminal action. For the next 22 months, Russ sat in prison waiting for trial, which finally began in late November 2013. Jurors listened as the prosecution built a strong case against Russ. They suggested Russ had been driven by rage when he found life insurance paperwork left on the kitchen counter. Also, the prosecution suggested Russ had left his phone at his friend's place during game night, made the 30-minute commute back to the Faria home murdered Betsy, and then a loyal friend from the group delivered his phone along with an Arby's receipt later that night to mislead investigators. When the 911 call was played for the jury, the prosecution also argued Russ's emotions were over the top and insincere, saying he was faking his reaction to Betsy's brutalized body, and then there were the slippers. The blood on Russ's slippers found in the bedroom closet was damning, no doubt about it. When Pam was called to testify as a witness for the prosecution, she reinforced the argument that the Faria marriage wasn't the happy one it seemed to be, not happy at all. After the dust settled from the end of the trial, some questions about Betsy's murder were anything but answered. It turns out the jury had not been allowed to hear facts that Russ, as attorney Joel Schwartz, was sure would have changed the outcome of the trial. Because of this, Russ was granted a retrial on June 5, 2015. In fact, the judge went so far as to describe the original trial as rather disturbing. Just 2 weeks before the retrial, a shocking bombshell was dropped. A forensic expert found a document on a Faria computer. It seemed to be an email Pam had mentioned to police a few years earlier, and it detailed Betsy's fears about Russ. In the email, she wrote that she felt he was going to hurt her and mentioned an incident where Russ supposedly held a pillow over her face. She asked Pam if she would serve as beneficiary to Betsy's life policy so Pam could handle funds for Betsy's daughters. With this new evidence, the retrial was going to be a tough battle. November 2, 2015 arrived, and the trial started. Once again, the prosecution painted Russ as the abusive husband and Betsy as the fearful victim. The defense said it looked like Betsy had been dead for some time when Russ found her body. And a paramedic's testimony supported that claim, saying she was cold and stiff to the touch when he got to the scene. However, Russ's lawyer also introduced a new potential suspect, and it was none other than, you guessed it, Pam Hupp. She was the last to see Betsy, after all. Some odd things about Pam were about to come out. There were inconsistencies in Pam's earlier accounts of the evening. At first, she'd said she hadn't gone inside Betsy's home. Another time, she said she'd stayed at Betsy's for 20 minutes. At trial, she testified she was back home by 7:27. Phone records showed she had called Betsy at that time. But why didn't Betsy answer the call? Most importantly, as shown by cell phone records, why was Pam still within 3 miles of Betsy's home when she made the call? Perhaps the strangest, most unbelievable twist was a police officer's testimony that during the previous summer, Pam had described her and Betsy as get-this lovers. According to Pam, they'd been in a secret romantic relationship for 10 years, and boy, had Russ been angry when he found out? Then the document found on the Faria computer was introduced, not a great development for Russ, or was it? The defense expert testified the letter had been planted 5 days before Betsy was murdered. It was the only document on the computer with an unknown author, and it had been created in a word processing program the computer didn't even have. Interesting. So if Betsy hadn't written the email, who had? Russ's bloody slippers were also addressed, but a CSI who had investigated the scene testified the slippers looked like they'd been dipped in blood, not worn through a bloody area. On top of this, cell phone records, receipts, and even store footage backed up Russ's account of the evening as he ran errands and got his Arby's meal. On November 6, 2015, the judge decided the case. This time, Russ was acquitted. But a very important question still remained. If Russ hadn't killed Betsy, who had? Russ's lawyer literally couldn't rest. He was losing sleep over the murder despite his client's acquittal. Prosecuting attorney Askey had no intention of pursuing any other suspect, but Schwartz's gut told him someone else was going to die, an ominous prediction that would soon prove true. In what seemed like a completely unrelated event, on August 16, 2016, Pam was in her car in her driveway when a strange man confronted her. She jumped out of the car and rushed into her home, but the man followed her inside. Operator 2, 911. What's your emergency? Pam. Hey, hello, there's someone breaking into my house. Help, help. What's the address you're at? Pam, help. Ma'am, indistinct. Pam, I didn't enter the car with you. Now get away. Get out, get out, get out. Gunshots. Narrator. Then 5 shots rang out. Pam's flat tone in this clip is kind of strange. She doesn't seem to be showing much emotion despite the situation. It almost sounds like she's reading from a script. This type of scenario should trigger a fight-or-flight response, which is the body's way of dealing with extreme stress or danger, and is usually shown by yelling, screaming, or crying, all the opposite of Pam. Pam told police how the intruder had tried to kidnap her to get Russ's money and yelled that he was going to kill her. That's when she'd found her revolver, pointed it, and shot him. After questioning, Pam was released, but in time, the truth would come out in a way no one could have imagined. About a week later, St. Charles County prosecutors and investigators said further investigation had led them to develop their own theory. It went something like this. Pam needed to divert attention from herself, since it was known Betsy's case was being looked into again. She tried to make it look like she'd been attacked by an assassin sent by Russ, then shot the man in self-defense. And Joel's prediction of another casualty had sadly come true. Pam was finally arrested. Footage shows Pam being questioned, then grabbing a pen and tucking it into her clothing behind her back. She asks for a trip to the restroom, and suddenly chaos erupts at the police station. Officer, there is a female officer here who is going to escort you to the bathroom, okay? Male officer, hey, we need a medic here. Pam. Narrator, Pam had tried to kill herself by hurting her neck and wrists with the pen she'd hidden. Authorities believed Pam's bizarre suicide attempt showed her guilt in the killing of the alleged intruder. He was identified as 33-year-old Louis Gumpenberger, who was mentally and physically disabled because of a terrible car crash in 2005. It definitely didn't to help Pam when cell phone records showed a ping near the home Louis shared with his mother and son, just 45 minutes before she made the 911 call. The call seemed like nothing more than a bad performance on Pam's part. And how had Louis made the 13-mile trip to Pam's home? He rarely left his apartment except for short walks with his mother. Furthermore, in Louis' pocket were 9 $100 bills. It just so happened that 4 of the bills were in sequence with a $100 bill found in Pam's dresser. An unlikely coincidence, don't you think? A strange note was found in Louis' pocket. It seemed like a pitiful attempt to incriminate him, but it was pretty obviously planted. Then a chilling piece of information came out. Louis wasn't the only person Pam had supposedly tried to lure into her vehicle. 6 days before his death, a police report was filed by a woman who'd been approached by a Dateline producer at her home in St. Charles County. The offer was tempting. She would be paid $1,000 by the producer just for reenacting a 911 call for the show. But her instincts told her something wasn't right. She'd made the mistake of getting into the car and quickly told the woman to take her back home. The woman did, and her home security camera caught footage of the 2016 Acadia and the license plate. The vehicle was found to belong to, yes, Pam Hupp, on August 12, 2019. Pam was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for killing Louis. The death penalty was taken off the table when Pam entered an Alford plea. An Alford plea is where there's strong evidence of guilt, but a defendant doesn't have to actually admit to the crime to plead guilty and accept a plea bargain. This is often done to try to avoid the worst possible sentence for the crime. In July 2021, yet another outrageous twist in this strange story happened. At long last, Pam was formally charged with first-degree murder in the death of Betsy Faria. Perhaps after all the years since Betsy's death, justice could finally be on the horizon for family and friends of the woman whose life was cut short. That's how this story ends for now. But before we go, I'll give you one more intriguing tidbit. Pam's mother, 77-year-old Shirley Newman, died about 2 years after Betsy's murder in 2013, years before Pam was arrested. But the cause of death was anything but natural. She fell from her apartment balcony 3 floors up. Apparently, she had a large amount of Ambien in her system. The cause of death was ruled undetermined. It's said that Pam was the last person to see Shirley alive. Was it simply an accident, or something more sinister? Maybe we'll never know. Here are some red flags from this case. For one, it was a red flag that Betsy changed her life insurance beneficiary to Pam only a few days before she died. The fact that Pam changed her story several times about whether she went inside the house or not should have set off some alarm bells. The phone call she made to her husband as she was leaving, in which Betsy can be heard in the background, could have been a very strategic move to provide proof that Betsy was alive when Pam supposedly left. Pam's very strange 911 call before shooting Louis. It is possible she was overly confident, thinking her story would be believed, so she didn't need to put much effort into convincing the dispatcher how to avoid similar situations. One big takeaway from this case is to remember that money can affect people in different ways. And greed can be a very dangerous thing. If someone is trying to persuade you to make changes about who will inherit your money or about increasing your life insurance, don't make any rush decisions even if this person makes convincing points.